Good evening. We still have some people coming in and taking a seat, but I'll try not to bother them if they don't bother me. I want to once more welcome you to this celebration of the 50th anniversary of the Metropolitan Government of Nashville and Davidson County, the merger that, as we know, took place 50 years ago, and we're right in the middle of that celebration. Some of you were there that first day in front of City Hall. The tents were up, the band was playing. We all sang happy birthday, and we're going to do it again next April. In the meanwhile, we're having these monthly meetings to go back and reminisce and then evaluate the past and the present. And tonight we are addressing the subject of education. And George Cate, the first Vice Mayor of Nashville, who, along with our colleague, Senator Thelma Harper, the three of us have been asked by Mayor Carl Dean, who's here again, as always, as usual. Thank you, Mayor. And it's really a wonderful opportunity to come together and reminisce about just how this unique form of government came to be. We've started at the very beginning with our first meeting here and evaluated what happened in the election, and then went on to some of what happened as we began to put the government together. And tonight we're going to address that very first effort to merge two school systems. It was, I think, without question, the most difficult of all the challenges we faced. The easiest was the health department because it had been merged several years before Metro came into being. Another thing we've done each week here, we've honored one of the distinguished former mayors of Metropolitan Nashville. Of course, Mary Beverly Briley was our first mayor, and we've honored him. We've honored, and many of you were here the night we recognized the contributions of Mayor Dick Fulton. We've recognized Phil Bredesen for his role before he became the governor of our state. And tonight we're going to honor Mayor Bill Purcell for all he did to make this movement toward the progressive city that Carl Dean has inherited and is moving forward with. Bill Purcell played a vital role in building that bridge to the future that's been so progressive, made this such a progressive city in so many different ways. You know, one of the great privileges for me, and I know for Thelma and George, to be part of this is that people we've been able to work with. And we've had three chairs, all of whom are here tonight. I haven't mentioned their names before as a trio, but I will tell you that Carol Busey, who has head our education project, Pat Nolan, who's back again, strong, we're happy to say, and healthy, and Beth Siegenthaler Courtney has been the third chair who has headed the events program, and Carol headed education, and Pat has done a wonderful job with the media. And I want to ask you all to remember these monthly meetings. It's a great tribute to the mayors who have served this city to have you come and to recognize them. I want to thank the Tennessee Education Association for making it possible for all of us tonight to celebrate our First Amendment right to a free drink. Thanks to TEA. One of the great privileges for me is to look out in that audience and see the people who who meant so much to this city over so many years. And it's nice to see its passing on is from generation to generation. I mentioned before how great it has been to see Torrey Johnson and Dewey Brandstetter here. Both of their fathers played such a vital role in that first Charter Commission and again in the second one. They helped draft the document that makes it possible for us to lead, for these mayors to lead into the future. And tonight, I want to say again how proud I am to be in the presence of so many distinguished leaders. And one of them is going to talk to us tonight about the distinguished record of Mayor Carl Dean. I'm sorry, of Mayor Bill Purcell. Carl, we'll get to you in a week or two, in a month or two. We'll get to you. But Carl Dean is here tonight to join again in paying tribute to Bill Purcell. You know, I remember when Mayor Purcell was in the legislature and he was leader, and one of the most inspiring things I think ever said about him was by Ned McWhirter, whom I was talking one day, and it was a tough legislative session. I said, "How are things going?" And he said, "Well, I've got Bill Purcell down there keeping me straight." And then he said, "And that is one hell of a job." But Bill Purcell has done one hell of a job in whatever he's done. And here to talk about that great job that he's done is Lois D. Berry, distinguished member of our state legislature, the pro tem, as she is known by her colleagues. It's wonderful to have you here, Lois, and I'm going to just sit back now and ask you to come and join in this tribute to one of our 6 great mayors, Lois D. Berry.
Thank you so very much. It is certainly an honor for me to have this privilege to say a few words about not only a friend, but a dear friend, a colleague and an ally that I've worked with across the years. I said after I got off the plane coming from D.C. that I'll never do this again, not even for Bill Purcell. There are a lot of things I can control, but the Delta airline I could not. But I told the pilot what I had to do, so he made a special effort to get me here on time. I met Bill Purcell when he was first elected to the legislature back in 1988. Even back then, it was clear to me that he would someday become the majority leader of the Tennessee House of Representatives. It was clear to me that he would become mayor of Nashville, Tennessee. A practitioner, a professor of politics, it was clear to me that one day he would end up at Harvard, but he would come back home. Bill loves people. He loves his work, he loves his play, he loves his family, and perhaps more importantly, he loves being in the arena, where his face was sometimes marred by the passion and the sweat that comes from strong and active leadership. It is here in the arena of civic life and civic engagement that we truly see the real Bill Purcell at his best, speaking, debating, fighting, standing for the least among us. When he missed the mark, he did so while daring greatly. He learned that your best stories come from your struggles, that the seed of your success are in your failures, and that your praise will be born of your pain. As I thought about the issues and the leadership challenges that Bill Purcell faced, there's one that comes shining through, and it is especially relevant today given the temper of our times. Last week we learned that 31 children died on the watch of the State Department of Children's Services. Yesterday, a famous football coach was sentenced to prison for preying on families and raping children. A few weeks ago, a bishop was convicted and sentenced and placed a known child molester among children. And it is this context that we can truly appreciate Bill's leadership in passing legislation to create a new Tennessee Department of Children's Services. For 1,000 years, men have considered working with children women's work. And it's a testimony of his leadership that Bill Purcell led this legislature to fully appreciate the role real men have in caring for, advancing, and protecting the welfare of the very lives of our children. Through his thoughtful action and leadership, Bill Purcell reminds us that none of us, without insulting our own nature, will be content within the deprivation of our rights, and that our responsibility, indeed, one of our solemn duties as leaders and public servants, is to recognize the bad rules, the bad laws and policies, and regulations of the worst form of tyranny, because they come with the endorsement of people that are true liberty in the danger when it is nibbled away in the name of a quick and easy fix. It is in this spirit that has always driven the Bill Purcell that I know. And it is in this spirit that we are blessed that he answered the call to service. Our beloved city and our country and this state has some difficult days ahead. Far too many of us are polarized by issues of race, religion, class, sex, education, poverty, and economic status. So let us never forget the price that we paid for this day. Let us always remember that we share a common faith in the solidarity of the human race, and that we must work and build and move forward together to build a world in which everyone is free and that has the opportunity to perform at its very best in pursuit of excellence. This may be a dream, but it is certainly worth believing and fighting for. So to characterize Bill in closing, I reminded the words of a citizen who wrote, "If you will not fight for the right when you can easily win without bloodshed, if you will not fight when your victory will be sure and not too costly, you may come to the point when you will have to fight with all the odds against you and only a small chance for survival. There may be even a worse case. You may have to fight when there is no hope of victory, because it is better to perish than to live as slaves." Bill, real leaders are ordinary people with extraordinary determination, and you truly are a real leader, and we are blessed to have you in our state. Thank you. Yes.
I want to say to Dolores DeBerry, while she has been speaking, images of Bill Purcell have been flashing on the screen, and they're continuing to, Bill. And if you'll come forward, and Lois is going to present you
with the flashing screen.
Yeah, that's right.
After Lois DeBerry has spoken, you feel the need to call for the benediction and form the parade. I cannot tell you what an honor it is to be recognized by my neighbors and my friends and by my mayor and my publisher in this space. But for me in particular, to have Lois DeBerry come and reflect in the way that only Lois DeBerry can is a memory and a privilege and an honor that will be enduring, and I'm very thankful for that. This is a special series that the mayor and Senator Harper, George Cate, and John Siegenthaler have proposed and are in the process of delivering. It really is a recognition of 50 critical years in the life of a people, but more importantly, of a beginning that starts again and hopefully allows us not just 50, but 50 more and 50 after that. I think, though, as Carl Dean has said many times, I've always felt if you don't focus on where you've been, there is no chance that you will move ahead safely and securely to the highest ground. And thinking about tonight, I was especially appreciative that Tam Gordon arranged for this to be an education night. That was and remains my passion. It is the most important thing this city does. Many of you, Carol Busey, may recall that we called ourselves first the Athens of the West, and then we got a better map and we realized that we were the Athens of the South. But when we said that, it was really aspirational, because the truth is we weren't quite Athens. We weren't quite Athens at all. We tried a school, and we tried another, and that didn't succeed. By 1850, we weren't sure what to do. We sent Dr. Hume off to Boston and Philadelphia to look about what should be done. It's 1850. 1854, the first school for our city that continues to serve us. But it reminds us it's not been that long. It's not been that long, truthfully, until we merged those two systems. Bob Bogan was there. You will hear more about that tonight. And started out on a new journey together. But putting it in context for me as mayor, Dewey knows it was the year before I became mayor that we became a unified school district, that for the first time we were out from the control of the federal courts, not very long ago at all. By the time I came in 1999, I'd promised to visit every school, and I asked Mark Hill, my assistant, to call, and I remember he called the school district and said, how many schools are there the mayor needs to know? I probably should have known before I promised to visit them all, but I didn't. He came back to me and he said, they want to know how you would count them. And I said, well, you know, Mark, I'm a new mayor. I'm not sure, but I thought 1, 2, 3. And then when you got to the last school, you'd know how many you have. And so he went back and came back again, and he said, they say if you count them that way, there are 129. I still don't know how else you would count schools. But we started out, and over the course of the next 8 years, I visited each of those schools, and then again, and finished with 550 school visits, and with the support of council members like Ginger Hauser, who I see here, and others who were there throughout, and a mayoral staff that I can say honestly is the best mayoral staff that there has ever been. And I can say that without offending anyone, because most of them still work for the mayor. And that's a good sign about them, and a good sign about him, and a good comfort for me for the long-term future. We raised funding for schools by more than 50%. We put $446 million in capital into those schools in those 8 years. We began to bring parents into the schools in a way that produced the largest First Day festival. You saw a picture of it. In America, more than 20,000 parents and kids celebrating that school was coming together again. But having said all of that and all of that commitment, the most important thing was that we came to believe that education is the most important thing that we do, that it always had been, even when we didn't know, even when they weren't sure in the 1850s what to do, and that it would always be the most important thing. And the greatest feeling of legacy or accomplishment, perhaps, that I hope that I may have is that having finished those 8 years in such incredible company, with such incredible support and help from everybody in this city, we believe that, and the proof is here in this new great mayor who gets up every day, everywhere he goes in this city or in this country, and says that same thing again, and reminds everyone again that the commitment is critical going forward. And I'm very, and will be eternally thankful to Carl for the leadership he's shown on that issue, the fact that he brings us together again here today to talk about education, and that in the process gives us the opportunity to remember as well what I think the Tennessee Education Association first perhaps explained to me, but made clear, and I think believes today, that in the end it's a great teacher with a reasonable number of kids, with outstanding supervision and a principal and others who make all the difference for all of our kids. So that being said, I thank you for the recollections of many happy days together. I look forward to the conversation tonight, and I hope you'll allow me just 2 more quick recognitions, because it's important to me. Beyond the fact that my councilman is here, and I'm very pleased that Peter Westerholm is my councilman. I'm out of practice, Carl, but I eventually know I need to get it all in. John Siegenthaler is, I need to say out loud now, truly one of the most important and natural resources that any city or place ever had. It's just so. And the fact that we all know what a great newspaper is and what journalism means and what a difference that makes in a place is all attributable to John Siegenthaler. The relationship between the press and politics, the critical role of oversight, open records, all the things go on, and there'll be many other times to recognize him, I know. But I wanted to say that out loud at the same time that we all celebrate who we are and where we've been and what we're going to do in education. We also remember that John has always been there to convene us at those critical and important moments in the history of our city, and for that I'm very thankful. One more thing, my goodness, that I was going to begin with, and I got distracted by Lois DeBerry. I'm the...
You saved the best for last.
You need to know that my mother is here. And my mother was the daughter of a public school teacher. And my mother became herself a teacher at the college level. And I married a woman with a degree in education from the University of Memphis who has worked all of her life. The most important work she's done has been with children. So this focus that we have on education for me, as I think for everyone in this room, is not something intellectual or academic. It really is, as Lois said, what God intended us to do. And I am confident that with them watching over me, I will never fail to remember that. Thank you both very much.
Bill, for all you've done to make this city great, my deepest appreciation. And we speak for people far removed from our voices. We're in your debt. We thank you for all you've done, and we thank you for coming tonight. I'm going to ask Mayor Dean to come forward and say a few words, just because he's the person who started this, and he's the person that sort of had envisioned that we would make this this celebration an ongoing 9-month affair, and all of you here have heard him before. The interesting thing is he never repeats himself. Somehow, Mayor Purcell, that's been a tradition of Nashville mayors. So let me introduce Carl Dean and ask him to come forward and extend his welcome.
Well, thank you, John, and thank you to Thelma and George for being the co-chairs of this this great effort, I think, and also Representative DeBerry. It's wonderful to see you. I'd really like to take us a few minutes to thank Bill Purcell, and my remarks will be a little bit personal because that's was really the way I think about all this. Bill did a lot of great things as mayor. You can think of the way he worked in having an efficient government, the way he did the audits that were necessary to make sure that we moved toward efficiencies and cost savings, the work he did with neighborhoods. I agree, the fantastic work you did with education, particularly in capital spending to bolster the classrooms themselves. And the general prosperity the city had during the entire time that you were mayor. Are all true hallmarks. But from my level, Bill and I have known each other for a long time. We actually can say that we met in jail. And when we were both public defenders, and we were in the Stallman building, Ed, before it was fashionable. We worked there, and it was a great place to be. But he was a tremendous person to work for. I, of course, was director of law when he was mayor, and his sense of humor, his compassion for everybody who worked on the staff is well known, and the affection they all hold for you and Debbie and your family is evident by their presence here today. And it was a great group and remains a great group. And so I think you did a wonderful job in who you hired, and a lot of them are still around, I think, and still doing great work. And the other thing, this is sort of a personal one, too, to me, is one of the things you probably doesn't get enough credit for is the work he did building the Birch building, a new criminal court, which was desperately needed, and renovating the courthouse. When you think about spending political capital and doing things, building buildings for lawyers is, if you polled that, would not be high on the list. And building buildings for government operations to take place in are not high on the list. But both of those projects were desperately needed. And if you come to downtown Nashville now and you look at one of the hallmarks of our city, which is the public square in front of the courthouse, which you and I remember very well as being metered parking lots when we walked across from the Stallman building to go to General Sessions Court to practice. It is now a gathering point where there'll be 7,000 people tomorrow night listening to music. And it is really a very, very positive statement for our city that will live for many, many years. And so every day when I go into the building, I do think of you, and I think about what it meant to get that project done and how it wasn't something that everybody necessarily in the city thought had to happen, but it did have to happen. And the Birch Building, I think, is even more so. We desperately needed that courthouse, and now we have it, and we're doing a better job in an area that's vitally important for our city. So I do repeat myself sometimes, John. This is one thing I say a lot is as mayor, I get to say this, and on behalf of the entire city of Nashville, thank you, Bill. Thank you for what you did and for the city and what you continue to do. And you're still a young guy, so we'll see where we go. And Debbie, thank you for all you've done, too. I know that I'll be reminded tonight how hard the job is. Thank you.
Well, I think you can listen to the voice of two mayors and recognize why this city has made the progress it has. Everyone who's come has paid a great tribute to you tonight. None more than the school teacher seated on your left. Thank you so much for coming tonight and helping us all honor Mayor Bill Purcell. Tonight we're going to talk about education, George. George was our first vice mayor. Torrey Johnson and Dewey Branstetter both would tell you nothing more consumed the interest of their fathers or the other members of the Charter Commission than how to put together in a meaningful way two separate school systems. The county system in those days, in many instances, was a rural system. The city was urban and becoming, with every passing year, a city where people were having trouble funding education. And there was the hope that this merger would make such a great difference. I'm going to ask George to introduce the members of this distinguished panel. I'll tell you, there's an awful lot of brain power sitting on your left, George. And so without further ado, I'll ask you to present that brain power. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. Mayor Dean, Mayor Purcell, distinguished panel members, ladies and gentlemen, we do tonight celebrate one more chapter of 50 years of the Metropolitan Government. And our purpose tonight is to talk about education. Please look at your program and look at the biographical information about Ed Kendall and Bob Bogan and Mary Catherine Bradshaw and see where they came from, what their experience is. We're very fortunate to have them as panel members tonight because they come with different backgrounds and different perspectives on education and the system of education that we have under the Metropolitan Government. I'm most gratified to have the opportunity to ask a few general questions to toss out to them for discussion. And when we have finished that part, I'll hope that we can save enough time that the floor can be open for questions or comments that you have. Your questions may be directed to an individual panel member or to the entire panel. And your comments, if you wish to make those, I encourage you to keep them within limited time, since our time is short for this program. Public education is a major mission and function of every local government. And that certainly is true of the Metropolitan Government of Nashville and Davidson County. So my first question is a very general one. How do you as an individual evaluate where we are in public education today under the Metropolitan Charter and with the leadership we have? And if you wish to add to it, what is your perception of how the general public feels about our system of education? What are its strengths? What are its weaknesses that you've seen? What turmoil has it gone through in 50 years? What issues does it deal with today? But my question then is this. 50 years later, how has public education fared under the Metropolitan Charter? Ed, let me turn to you first because you've had an interesting part of school board experience. How do you see it from that perspective?
Well, you know, first let me say that since the election, I've spoken to 4 different groups and heard Ms. Sigenthal talk about all this brain power over here. My wife told me tonight, she said, you need to stop going to these. They're going to eventually find out you don't know anything. So I'm gonna try to say some things that will be helpful. You know, one of the things I was looking back when Tam asked me to come, and I looked through some of the minutes. I was able to find some from the county government in 1961, 62, somewhere along in there, and I was amazed at the minutes. I mean, it was like, we're going to buy some drapes. We're going to, I mean, it was just numbers. You know, the whole meeting was about purchasing or hiring teachers or transferring. I didn't see any policy issues hardly at all. I didn't get a chance to look at the city. Well, I couldn't find it. It's probably in the archives. But that was some interesting, there was a research done also by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, which showed that when they combined the county and the city boards of education, I think it was 1964, July 1 was the first meeting they held. The county actually benefited significantly from that. Teachers, I was surprised, teachers were paid about $1,000 less a year. Now that doesn't sound like a lot in today's time, but that was $4,800 versus $5,800 in 1962, 63 actually. Then in 1965, when they combined the two, the county and city salaries, of course, were the same. Also, the textbook spending for textbooks, that kind of surprised me too, was like $235,000, and that increased to like for the county, but that increased about $700,000 when the two were combined. So to try to get at the question from my perspective, of course, I grew up in Nashville. I grew up on Jefferson Street. Went to Pearl High School. I was a graduate of Pearl High School in 1963. Actually, I was in my senior year when the systems were when the government was combined into Metropolitan Government, and I didn't know a lot then. You know, as a young man, I saw what was going on around me, and I heard the arguments on both sides. But we were still pretty much a segregated school system, even in 1963. So at Pearl High School, it was all African American school, even though the Brown case was in 1954, I believe, and then in '56, the city decided it would integrate one year at a time, starting at the first grade. So it hadn't gotten to high school when I left high school. But I think the combining of the two systems was a magnificent thing. I think had we not, and I don't mean to demean Memphis in any kind of way, but had we not, I think we would have a similar situation that they have in Memphis, with the inner city being predominantly all black in the school system and the county system being different. I think the reason we're able to talk about now, and I say intelligently talk about, some people say we're confrontational and all that, I think it's healthy that we're able to talk about this whole issue of diversity and how we can accomplish that in Nashville. And I think we're doing a pretty good job at that. You know, we disagree sometimes. The paper tries to print names and say Ed Kendall disagrees with Mayor Dean or something like that. But Mayor Dean and I are good friends. By the way, Bill Purcell is an excellent man. I served under 6 mayors, not as on the Board of Education, but in some capacity, starting with Beverly Brawley, and 4 as a member of the school board. But Bill Purcell, I'm gonna stop. I know we don't have. Bill Purcell has always impressed me. When he got up there then, he never has a piece of paper in his hand. And he gets up and talks impromptu, and he remembers everybody in the room's name. I don't know how he does that. But the most fascinating thing about Bill Purcell, to me, is his style, his walk. Have you all ever watched him? Walk just like Bill Clinton. I mean, you know, that kind of cool walk when he comes up. And that impresses me. You know. But anyway, congratulations. And I'll move on. I may have something else to say. Go ahead.
Brother Bogan, you have seen public education from an interesting perspective over a period of time as a a primary role with the Metropolitan Nashville Education Association, in more recent times on the Metropolitan Council. How do you feel public education has fared in these 50 years, and what are its strengths and weaknesses today?
Well, I really believe that public education has fared well, not perfectly, but it's fared well over the years because of the consolidation of city and county school systems. When I came here, I was hired by the school teachers to represent them in the city government or county government. It didn't matter. I had to learn both. I came from, at the time, from Fairfax County, Virginia, and the areas around Washington, D.C. were considering some kind of metropolitan government. That's where I first heard about it and went to some meetings where it was discussed. So I felt that I came here with some background in the concept of metropolitan government and found out that there had been a vote a couple of years before that which had failed. And I thought that was unfortunate because I felt that metropolitan government was going to be helpful to the school systems. The people in the city system who came under annexation, and I found this in my archives, this was a deposition by Mayor Ben West. And I learned a lot about his views of the situation where he had supported metropolitan government, but then turned against it and decided to go with the program of annexation. And his whole deposition told how he believed the city was overextending itself, helping the county, and you get into this back and forth stuff, but it was very interesting to hear, and he has the numbers to support his position. So I learned from that there were reasons why he did oppose the second vote on metropolitan government. However, the school personnel were taken in under annexation with no regard whatsoever for their benefits, for their protecting their benefits. And in the charter, which I also found, maybe some of you recognize this old charter, there was a big section dealing with protecting the rights of the school personnel. And it progressed on into the later charter, and it was just showing you that I did a little research. The charters protected the personnel, and at that time, as was already mentioned, it was a serious matter when your long-range goals in the system ended up with a pension that was no longer protected. Who knows? They didn't know what was going to happen to them in terms of their protection of their benefits. So that was one of my jobs when I was hired here, was to look into that. And I did, and discovered that metropolitan government had an answer for that particular issue. Now, there was desegregation going on. There are all other kinds of issues that I won't try to get into. We don't have the time. But on that particular one, the pension rights of the people in the city system who were taken in by annexation, if some of you were around during that time or have read about it, there was a large swath of the county that came under the jurisdiction of the city and increased the size of the council, some of you remember, and so forth. So that led me to believe that the only way we could justify going into a metropolitan, not the only way, but one of the ways to go into metropolitan government would be of advantage to the public school personnel who would be affected by a continued program of annexation, as Mayor West pointed out in his deposition. Very interesting document. So that's a little bit of what I've learned here just in the last couple of days that I wasn't totally aware of back when I first came here. So I know I've gone on longer than I need to, so I'll turn the...
All right, let's go to Mary Catherine then for a minute.
Let's do that.
You know, people in the Green Hills area will say, if someone has been a teacher at Hillsborough High School how can you have any more glory in later assignments? But if you'll notice from her biographical information, she's been on the cutting edge of education in this area for quite some time. So, Mary Catherine, let's hear your observations on how public education has fared under Metro.
Well, I'm honored to be on this panel. I was 6 years old in 1962. So when I realized what I had actually said yes to, I pulled out John Edgerton's book, and that took me to 1980. And I've been reading in the last several days. And Dr. Litterer hired me in 1983 at Hillsborough High School. So I came into this at that time in full support of public education. I think it's critical to a democracy. I thought that Hillsborough was the place that I wanted to teach because I wanted to teach for a woman I perceived to be a fantastic principal and a real instructional leader. She had a high priority on academics. At that time, Hillsborough High School was the only school that had all of the multiple handicap students. They had all of the ELL, or ESL as it was called then, students in the 1980s. And it was an incredibly diverse school. So my background in public education with 27 years at Hillsborough and then subsequently 1 year at MLK, those are my experience at Hillsborough allowed me to become a different person because of the diversity. So when the issue of diversity is mentioned at this point in time, I think that's a very important issue for all of us to pay attention to as we move into the next 50 years, because I think a system that even might run the risk, I'm not saying it does, I'm saying might run the risk of becoming segregated for any reason whatsoever, whether it's charter schools or neighborhoods or lack of a plan or whatever it is, that it's incumbent upon all of us to pay attention to that. And when I got the opportunity to go to Lead Academy, which is the first public charter high school, that was, I wanted to start my own charter school. So I was doing my homework and talking to charter operators and all these different people, and in the middle of my discussion with Jeremy Kane, he offered me a job. So I switched from MLK. And what I told those students, because school had already started, and I said, have you ever had the opportunity to choose between two really great choices, and have you ever seen something come at you when you didn't expect it? And that seems to have happened to me often in the last 5 or 6 years. Something just changes. And I told them that the reason that I wanted to shift and take advantage of the opportunity to go to Lead was because I think it's important for us to figure out how to get this right. There's no debating charters, they're here, whether you like them or not. But that's just another way to create one great school at a time. And as far as I'm concerned, that's really all we can do. In the course of the last 48 hours in studying this sort of consolidated government and metro government, it struck me as ironic that charter management systems and with networks of public schools may be the opposite of a consolidated system within the realm of education, because it seems to me that one thing we're moving away from is this sort of total system management that's set up in a hierarchy where charter management systems or networks have more autonomy. And it seems like it's part of a larger debate that's going on all across the country about the size and role of government, whether it's local government or state government or federal government. And so I think the greatest challenges would be closing the achievement gap. That's clearly a challenge. But it's a dilemma as well, because if you close a gap, you've got to take the top and it's got to move closer to whatever the lowest is. And if you're doing that, maybe the top isn't moving. So the challenge becomes creating a system and an informed citizenry that is sophisticated enough to look at how we can move the top and the middle and the bottom, not just look at how effectively the gap has closed, because we don't close the gap when we're moving everybody in a year's worth of progress. So that's a dilemma that's right now, and I think we've got to maintain a balanced system with intentional diversity, whether it's socioeconomic or racial, ethnic, religious, gender, whatever it is. And that's difficult in Nashville, and I'm a Nashvillian, a native Nashvillian, because our neighborhoods are more defined by race.
Good comment. You know, the vocabulary has changed in these 50 years. Nowadays, we talk about charters, and we talk about magnets, talk about a lot of things that weren't part of the vocabulary at all 50 years ago.
True.
Let's do a little rewind, push the rewind button for just a moment, and go back to 1962. As the school year closed just prior to the vote in June of 1962, we had a public school system of Nashville with a Board of Education, and William Henry Oliver as the former principal of East High School and now superintendent. We had a county school system with a Board of Education, and J.E. Moss as the superintendent of county schools. Now you come to a charter commission and say, write in a charter some provision for merging these systems into one. You know, it was interesting that we had one educator, one principal of Warner School, who was a member of the 10-member charter commission that wrote the charter. So we had representation, at least, from somebody that was a professional educators. But the charter named a new Board of Education.
Yes.
And it said, Mr. Oliver and Mr. Moss, you've got 2 years of transition.
Right.
You study the existing system, and you put together the plan of consolidation to be adopted 2 years from now. So for 2 years after we passed the charter by referendum, we were in a transition period deciding exactly how the two systems would be put together. Let me see, do you have any comment or suggestion? How effectively did they put it together? Do you have any things that you think we should have done differently? Or did Mr. Moss and Mr. Oliver do a creditable job with those that worked with them in consolidating two school systems into one? Ed, you got a comment on that?
You know, as I mentioned earlier, I was doing a little research myself, and the Department of Agriculture did this study, and they talked about the consolidation of the schools all the way through 1965 from the, and of course Mr. Oliver and Mr. Moss were co-administrators of the new metropolitan system, I think, until Mr. Harris was hired as the actual superintendent. But they listed in this study a lot of areas that they felt in the first 3 years of that were very significant. I mentioned a couple earlier about the textbooks and all, but also the per pupil expenditure increased significantly to about $410 a year, from $262 a year. Can you imagine that? We're talking now what, 10,000? But those kinds of things occurred. The class sizes, they were able to reduce the class sizes. The average class size was 32 in both systems at that time, and they reduced them down to 28. So I think there was some technical kinds of things. As I said before, equalization in salaries, teachers and other support staff. The county, prior to that time, of course, they depended upon, their budget primarily depended upon counting how many days of attendance that students had to get the money for the county system. And of course, the city had the advantage of also being able to tax, you know, for additional funds. Plus, they had programs that they had got money from federal government and this kind of thing. So the city was in much better shape than the county at that time. So that merger was a good merger. As a matter of fact, this report lauded that merger and said the first 3 years were probably the most important times of the the most important thing that happened actually with the consolidation of the into Metro government.
How about you, Bob? Do you have any comments in that regard?
I do. I remember going around to the various schools, which is part of my job, and talking to the teachers of the African American community, the principals, and I learned that the textbooks were being passed down from the Caucasian group, whatever you want to call it, to the African American kids, which meant that they were getting textbooks that were pretty badly used. And that was true in many areas of the systems of government, systems in the school system that to me were very unacceptable. But at my particular job, I had to go with what was happening rather than what I thought ought to happen. Mm-hmm. And I think Ed Kendall would remember hearing from some of the African American principals as to what it was.
I had one of the books.
All right. That's right. Well, Mary Catherine, with that structure being designed, do you have any comment in this regard as to how we got started 50 years ago?
I think that the transition period of 3 years at the beginning and marking that as critical is probably still true. It might extend further than 3 years. And I think we're in a transition period, and it would probably be a good idea to go back and look at some of these documents, because the school system, Metro Public Schools, has undergone so many changes, particularly when you look at the influx of the immigrants in the 1980s. I mean, Nashville is no longer kind of a black and white city, if you will. It's much more diverse than it ever was in 1962. And so I think that our system must have been pretty effectively put together and merged to sustain those demands and those changes and the incredible population growth of the city itself and the suburbs, and the fact that the city was the urban renewal that has gone on in the last 25 years. The system, the school system as it formerly was, without charters, sustained itself, and there's no denying there are a lot of really important, very powerful, creative, talented people who graduated from Metro Public Schools. And I can name a whole bunch of them.
All right. Ed, do you want to comment further?
You had mentioned some of the things maybe that could have been done, or that I think might have been done. You know, I'm a person who I think everybody knows believes in proactive kind of taking issues ahead of being guided by laws and this kind of thing, but doing things for the right reason in my mind. And I think back then, had the school systems, when they first merged, had they thought about and actually merged staffs in terms of racial, very little of that went on. Mm-hmm. You know, the schools still remained, even after that, predominantly white or black. And of course, in the inner city, most of the inner city black kids went to inner city schools at that time. That's where they were pretty much located. And I think maybe had we started back then doing some of those kinds of things, I know it was difficult politically to do a lot of that, but had we started that process, I think we might be further along now, gotten further along earlier. Dewey even remembers when on the board in the 80s, we had some of these same discussions. I mean, we had some schools that almost refused to have black principals. Mm-hmm. Yep. You know, this was during the 80s when Dewey was on the board and I first came on the board. And I think Dr. Benjamin appointed one, I'm not going to call the name of the school, and the parents were just, I mean, they were livid. But this principal turned out to be the most popular principal in the school system after a couple of years. But I think we've got to do things even when we know that politically it might not be the popular thing to do. We've got to do those things to move forward and do it in a proactive way.
Okay. I really believe,
Bob?
I really believe that we're not aware sometimes of what all transitions meant to the school system under the court-ordered desegregation. That certainly put a wrench in the efforts to consolidate, because it meant that you had to go back and redo the whole plan. And this happened more than once, as I recall. Now, some of you may know better than I, but that's my recollection. In fact, I did find one that said, school desegregation, new definitions, October 1979.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's what was happening. The system was undergoing almost constant revisions and changes that would be disturbing, and yet they were able to survive during those periods of transition and change. And I'm quite interested in the issue of charters, to be honest with you. I was a candidate just recently, an unsuccessful one, but I know that Amy Frog, who is the school board person from my district now, did quite a job in her first meeting. I won't go into that, but I realize that charters are becoming an issue here as they have across the country. And in some places, the charters have been clearly designed to pad the pockets of some entrepreneurs who believe they need some more money for their programs, and the way to get them is to go to the taxpayers through the charter school movement. Now, I understand that's not all the cases, but that is something I have to deal with as a person who's dealt with the school systems.
Mary Catherine, you want to add anything to that?
I didn't know she was from Lead Academy. That's a school right
Join
up
in
the
the debate if you wish. All right.
right up the street from where I live, Lead Academy.
Okay. Well, I think again, I would share some of those same concerns. I think privatizing any public sector venue, whether it's Bechtel buying up all the water in public utilities or somebody else hijacking public education, is dangerous business, because if it's the government that is the monopoly, as some of the charter operators say, there's still a judicial system that parallels whatever there is there. And there is a way to seek remedy. If corporations and privatization sink in and have total control, then I don't know what the remedy is there. I don't know what that looks like. And that concerns me because it's really not about kids. I want to start a charter school myself because I think one school at a time is the way to do it. And I did spend 10 years putting in place the IB continuum in the Hillsborough cluster, because I thought it was important to have a tuition-free option for all kids that was not contingent upon a lottery like a magnet school and was not an independent school. And I felt strongly, and still do, that it needs to happen in a place that has the kind of diversity that Hillsborough High School had and still has. And I think that my year at MLK was fantastic. What a great school that is. It's diverse. But their mission statement says they accept students of proven academic talent. And so I found myself in the untenable position, as I do right now, of defending Metro Public Schools and charter schools. Both of those entities and institutions, I think, have their merits. And I think it is really critical for more people in this city to pay attention to what's happening as it happens and to step up, or we're going to step in it. We either got to step up or we're going to be in trouble and step in it.
You're suggesting that public input could have quite an impact here. Now, Cormac Cochran, who was the businessman and lawyer who chaired the Charter Commission, wrote later that the most divisive issue they had to deal with, would they have an elected board of education or an appointed board? The Charter Commission decided at that time, with several divided votes, that it was decided that it would be an appointed board. But along in 1982, that was changed. The charter was amended based on petitions that were signed by the public, and we went to an elected board. Is there any thought today there's going to be any change in that, or do we, for the foreseeable future, have an elected Board of Education? Any comment on that?
I hope so. I mean, seriously, I think, you know, I was around when we had an appointed board. I was living. But the difference is, you know, I've served on several boards. When I say several boards, the constituency of those boards has changed over the years. There are some very smart people who've served on these boards of education, including you, Dewey. But I'm serious. He was our chair.
He was a good board member.
31 years old, he was chair of the board, youngest probably ever been. But we've got some very sharp people who represent different constituencies in this community. And that's very important. When you have an appointed board, and I'm not sure, maybe somebody's smart enough, Mayor Purcell, to pick people who are going to have these. Because when it's said we're dysfunctional, we're not really dysfunctional. We're talking about issues that need to be discussed. You know, I used to hear people say, well, that board you're on is so dysfunctional, y'all don't agree on anything and all that. Well, if you got a board that sits up and agrees on everything, why have a board? You know, just rubber stamp everything and go home. So I think what has happened, you know, I'm trying to work General Johnson and the chief here Chief Anderson out of business, because when we talk about schools in the inner city, and I live in the inner city, we talk about emotional learning and social learning. That's important. I don't care what anybody says. You know, academics is important too. Obviously, we've got to. Obviously, that's what we're here for. But if we don't change kids in terms of citizenship and that kind of thing, we're not going to get anywhere. I mean, we're not going to get anywhere closing the achievement gap. See, when we first started magnet schools, we started Hume Falk, MLK, then Megas. These were academic magnets. Everybody got in mind, well, you know, everybody wanted to go to these schools. And granted, my two grandchildren went to MLK. But the idea behind having magnets then was for desegregation. That was the purpose of these schools. It wasn't for choice necessarily, or creating a school that's going to cream all the smart kids off. It was for desegregation. What happened, we started opening other charter schools, what are called themed charters. Like a design center.
Were they called charters?
Yeah, no,
magnets.
Magnets, I'm sorry. Called magnets. And people had in mind, well, they got to be better than these zone schools. We got zone schools, ladies and gentlemen, out there that are 10 times better than some of the charter schools. I mean, that was a study done in Chicago just a few days ago, where the zone schools are outperforming the charter schools. Now, I'm not opposed to charter schools. I want to make that very clear. I'm not opposed to charter schools, but I am opposed to creating charter simply for the purpose of choice, unless it's a choice that people haven't make intelligently. You know, just to say that school over there is located where I don't have to go to school with the kids who live over there in the Buena Vista area or Scoville Street area where I live, that's a bad choice. But if you're saying you're making that choice because the academics are better and that I can help change something in that school, then you're doing the right thing. But I think we've gotten too far into this, that zone schools are bad, charter schools and magnets are good, and that's just not the case.
Okay, Bob?
But you've got to make a thorough study of this, and I started doing that in my campaign, but I didn't get anywhere with it because I didn't know enough about some of these issues at the time I decided to become a candidate. I had no idea somebody was going to come into the district with $105,000 for a school board race. Come on, $105,000. We never heard of such money being thrown around in Nashville, Tennessee, Davidson County. That was ridiculous. I wouldn't have run if I had known that was going to be the issue, because who could stand up against $105,000? You know, follow the money kind of thing. But there was a young lady that I met that I thought, well, this young lady would be great on the school board if she can get elected. And I told her that I didn't think I was going to get elected, but I would surely hope you could, realizing $105,000 or $115,000, whatever it turned out to be, was going to be the final tote of Margaret Dolan, a very prominent lady in the city that I didn't know anything about before, who was enmeshed with the Chamber of Commerce and a lot of business interests. And we believe, now this is speculation, one of the persons designed to bring the charter school movement full force into this community. That's what
Okay.
we speculated. Now, I don't have any proof for that, so I just want to make that clear. But that was what several of us thought. And I just don't know where this is all headed, if that's what it's going to be.
Well, Mayor Catherine, do you have a comment to make on
that? She
that?
might have a lot of.
I have several. First, I think we already are moving into a different structure for a school board. I think we have an elected school board that will probably remain an elected school board for Metro Public Schools, but each of the charter schools has its own appointed board. So what we really have, or selected board, what we really have is a blended system already, because the charters are public schools and they're under the local education agency or association, the LEA, but there are different systems. They're parallel systems, if one could call them that. And so I think that's changed before anyone really realized it, to go back to your original question. And I think that the charter schools have the opportunity to create a different culture. And in my 9 weeks at Lead Academy, I can say that they have the culture piece right. That we have 195 students, 9th, 10th, and 11th on the high school campus. There are 3 other middle school campuses, and they take the time to pay attention to and build into the day that is typically a longer school day to address the things that Ed Kendall has mentioned, the social and emotional, those kinds of issues. And part of what's happening with the charter schools in this city, I think, is a function of a change in the state laws. Yeah. In 2007, when it was only free and reduced lunch students or students from failing schools who could attend charters, you had a pathway for a very homogeneous group. And then when the law changed and allowed anyone to enroll at a charter school, that's a game changer, just like the first law was a game changer. And so the challenge now, from my perspective, and what I really care about, is a great school. You know, I've got young nieces and nephews, and I want them to have schools in this city, tuition free, where they can go and get a great education, whether they want to be a television producer or a professor at a university. It doesn't matter to me, but they need to have the choices, just like every child needs to have a choice. And we need to address all students in terms of students who are underperforming for whatever reason, and students who are overachieving for whatever reason. Even overachievers can achieve more, and underachievers can certainly be addressed. And then the ones who want to be invisible, we've got to have enough people around to sort of draw them in and get them to buy into the community that is the school.
Now, after Bob makes one more comment, we're going to open this up, so if you have some questions you want to toss at the panel, I'll come back to you in just a minute. Bob?
How many of you in this room have heard of Great Hearts Academy? Let me see some hands. Okay, there was an interesting piece in the city paper which described the whole issue, or a lot of the issues connected with Great Hearts and why it was unsuccessful. One was electing Amy Frog to the school board, because she made the deciding vote as to whether they would come in or stay out. What irks me more than almost anything else, folks, all of you know that I have been in the school business for many years, is the very fact that there is a state board up here appointed by the governor at the state level for the whole state, with all those school systems in the state. And then here we have an elected school board, elected by the people of this community to serve their needs and what they want done. And I don't like this idea of this state group, appointed group, telling our elected group what they should do and have to do by legal processes or whatever you want to call it. I am really concerned over that issue as it develops. So that's, I wanted
Okay,
to
so
say.
it's obvious that there are many issues yet to be resolved. So let me see, if you wish to ask a question, stand up and do that. Tell us who you are and what question, and direct it to the panel.
I would like to turn this around and thank all of you who have participated in creating this great school system. I get my John Wayne up when people start criticizing the metro schools. My children went completely through the public school system. I have a professor of psychiatry at a major university, an architect, an engineer. So I want to thank all of you, and those that are not here that have created the school system, because, and also you saved me a lot of money because all my kids got scholarships.
Paid your taxes.
All right, here we go.
I want to go back to the historical question.
All right, let's see if you can. Oh, we got one more. All right, let's take the.
Right behind you, John.
Oh, thanks.
Okay.
I want to go back to a historical question.
Okay.
Court ordered desegregation was going on
Yes.
at the same time. What sort of impact, in addition to that, did consolidation have on the creation of private schools and the private academies and what we might call white flight schools and such? Well, historically, I'd like to get back to that side of things.
Okay, that's a question that's tossed at the panel. How do you feel? How did the Metropolitan Government have? What impact did it have in that respect? You want to comment, Ed?
I think it made it possible. I think had we not consolidated prior, you have to remember that the consolidation happened about 7 years before the white flight you're talking about, which was like 1971 after the Swan decision, is when we lost about 25,000, maybe 30,000 kids into the private sector. But I think had the consolidation not occurred prior to that, it would have been a much more difficult task to try to desegregate schools as much as we did, because you would have had the city, you had two lawsuits going on at the same time. Mm-hmm. You had the Kelly and then you had Maxwell.
Right.
And they combined the two once Metro became consolidated, so both operated under that same system. But I don't even know how it would have been possible, and maybe the people from Memphis, obviously they had two different school systems, and so did Chattanooga and maybe Knoxville. But I think it would have been much, much more difficult to get as far as we have. And I think we've gone a long ways, to be very honest, in terms of desegregating our schools. I'm just hoping that we don't start chipping away at it. That's my concern. Right. I think the thing is that we do still have a lot of pockets of poverty in the community. We don't have as much as we probably had prior to the merger. But we do have significant pockets of poverty where it just amazes me when people talk about vouchers, and that may be something you want to talk about later, but you're talking about taking kids out of a school, and I've heard people on TV with the state, very prominent people, call a school a lousy school. Mm-hmm. We need a failing school. Well, they actually said lousy. This particular one did. And say, well, parents ought to be able to take their kids out of that lousy school and send them somewhere. Well, what happens to kids that are still in that school? You take 20% out who are able to go to maybe another school with a voucher, and all of them won't be able to, because you still got to match money. I mean, these vouchers are what, $4,600, something like that? And how many private schools you get in $4,600? But my thing is, what happens to the kids that you're leaving behind? You're still leaving behind a more failing school when you really think about it. Right. So my thing is, we need to spend money, spend time, and focus on improving the schools that we have. And I strongly believe in that. Charter schools were designed originally. The reason they were for disadvantaged kids, it was to close the achievement gap. It was to find innovative and creative ways to deal with kids and teach kids in disadvantaged situations so you could close the achievement gap. And that didn't mean dumbing down. Mm-hmm. That meant finding ways that you can light that fire in those kids' mind where they wanted an education. I grew up in a community where education on Jefferson Street, this was before the merger. Right. I mean, education was expected. I mean, it wasn't like, where, if you're going to go to college, I graduated in a class at the Pearl High School, 63, with 250 students. 75% of those students went on to college. I don't know how many stayed, but 75% went on to college. We can't hardly get 75% of our kids now to graduate high school, you know, to just graduate. So, but that's where I think we've got to have our focus, is on what is there, what we have, and quit trying to run away from the poor kids. And I'm not accusing anybody of doing it, but quit trying to say, okay, let's just deal with the kids who are interested. We got to light the fire and make all kids interested.
Mayor Catherine, you want to comment?
I would be happy to.
All right.
In my reading of John Edgerton's book, and I'll give him the credit for the data, he said in 1970, when the desegregation issue or the order came, white enrollment in Metro Public Schools fell by 25%. Private school enrollment tripled. I don't have the numbers of new schools that were started, but I do know that my father started a school, Franklin Road Academy, around that time. I think it was 1971. And I know why he started his school. It was not the white flight piece that he has gotten credit for sometimes, because I was older than 6. I remember it. I know the discussions. He was very passionate about what he envisioned for a school. And so when I think about private schools, I certainly think Franklin Road Academy, at the time that it started, benefited from the white flight because he had clients. He had students. He had people who were looking for another alternative. And I think that that is a relevant issue right now when we look at the fact, and here's another fact, there is a great school in the Brook Mead building in West Mead right now. It is Lead Middle School. I've been there, and they're doing some great things. It is predominantly African American. It is, I don't know the percentages, but I'm just guessing probably 85 to 90% free and reduced lunch. And the very people who wanted great hearts in West Mead could certainly look at Lead Academy if they're so interested in a charter school. I think it speaks very clearly to fear that was just as predominant in 1970 that gave rise to the success of so many. And I think there's some great private schools. If we look at it one school at a time, a great school is a great school, whether it's parochial or independent or public or charter or magnet or whatever it is. It's serving the interest of the kids. But I think that the issue of race and the willingness to look at sharing a community like a school with a socioeconomic diversity and an ethnic diversity is still terrifying to a lot of people in Nashville, Tennessee. And if we are not thoughtful about how we do this and about how it unfolds, whether we are appointed or elected, it's the citizens who have to respond. And then we have to have school superintendents and people at Bransford Avenue or whatever the big institution is who will listen to the community. The government has to listen, not just through elections, but in the public discourse. And that does not happen with the frequency that it should in Nashville, Tennessee, in Metro Public Schools.
Let me see if there's another question. Anybody want to ask a question? Here we are.
That was a great segue, thank you. My question is, how do we get, because the number of people in Nashville now who currently have children in school, in any school, is really minimal, much more so than when I grew up here. How do we get everybody convinced that the most important thing for Nashville is to have a good school system? Because there are a lot of people who just see, the school system is over there for the people who have kids, and the rest of us are floating along. So how do we engage the rest of the community?
Who wishes to comment on that question?
Well, I think it's something that, I called a lot of people on the phone when I was running for office recently, and I spoke to some of those people You know, say, well, I don't have a child in the school system, you know. And of course, I start reminding them of the crime and a lot of other things that were going to impact their lives. And the idea that we've got to educate all children, and it does have a ripple effect, you know, and how we get the public to understand that, I don't know. I don't have the answer to that, but I think that's where we've got to focus our attention to people who don't have children in the school system, that it affects your life. It affects the entire city. I mean, unemployment, you know, people who are walking around not employed, robberies, burglaries, you know, all of these kinds of things are impacted by education. I mean, you know, I see people every day because I live in a community where there's a lot of unemployment, you know, and people standing on the corner and they think I can get them a job. They get mad at me because, you know, like they're mad at Obama because, you know, I can't get you a job today. But we've got to focus on that and convince people. We also got to convince people that public education is just as good as private education. You know, people talk about private schools, and I know a lot of people here, children probably went to private schools or maybe even going to private school. But when you think about it, we pay teachers 20% higher on an average than private schools. We have the technology that nobody has. I mean, that private schools could not possibly afford, or most of them. We have a lot of different things going on. But the difference is we educate everybody. You know, and in a private school, let's face it, most private school children come from families with two parents, families who also are generally educated. So you're looking at a different child, and you're looking at a different setting. So you're not really comparing apples and apples all the time. We have to educate children who can't read when they're in the third grade or come out of a condition where they come to school hungry. You know, and I'm not saying there's a good book, and I'm gonna call it, I'm selling for this guy, I guess, Eric Jensen, How to Teach in Disadvantaged Situations. And I think that's something that we forget about. We've got to raise these kids up. If we don't raise them up, like I said before, you know, it's not going to work. Diversity, when I talk about diversity, I'm not talking about you just got to be sitting together because you're black or white or you're rich or poor. But all the research shows that kids who come out of poverty tend to do better in diverse climates. And it doesn't hurt the other kids who are in that diverse climate. Matter of fact, it helps when you think about what they learn from those kids. There was a gentleman on the board, and I'm through, I'm not going to,
oh, no,
but
there
used to be a gentleman on the Board of Education who I'm not going to call his name, but he and I used to bump heads a lot. He was very conservative, and I was a pretty liberal guy. And he told me one time, Thelma, you come into this picture. He said, you know, he said, my kids went down to Thelma Harper's house. I think you were living in Haynes Manor at the time. And they came back and they were just appalled that she had a bathroom. That, you know, that these people lived in houses and they talked and they sat and ate breakfast and that kind of thing. Because the children, these particular children were accustomed going to school with were generally kids who came from very impoverished situations, you know, and that's what they understood. But, you know, that's the reason I talk so much about diversity, because it's a part of the learning process. I'm sitting here today, you know, I went to all black schools all my life, except law school, and but I was able to get here wherever I am. But I think it's important, and a lot of it has to do with my experience since I've been grown. You know, George Cate came and spoke at Pearl High School when I was in 11th grade. He spoke to my class. He doesn't remember that. I can almost tell you what he said.
I spoke to a lot of people when they were just in the 11th grade.
But I can almost remember what he said, and it was good. But I'm saying, you know, those kinds of experiences are things that we've got to face in this community and across this country. We've got to sit down and face our fears, first of all, you know, and our stereotypes. And until we do that and honestly talk to each other on a regular basis, I'm not talking about some seminar where everybody comes and everybody hollers hooray and go home and think the same way. We've got to have those regular meetings of mind, discuss what our fears are, what our stereotypes are, and I got some too. But and until we do that and do it, and I think the school system is a prime place to start that, we're never going to get anywhere. You know, we're going to still have this debate about diversity. What is it? You know, how many kids you got to have here? And we went through that, do it back in the 80s and 90s about percentages. You know, we got to have 30% black. All that's a bunch of garbage. You know, I don't even
What's
like
a bunch of garbage?
About how many percentages. That doesn't mean anything. It's about having the structure that's welcoming for all kids in a school, that you have the resources for all kids, no matter where they come from, and you have accessibility for those kids, true accessibility. I'm talking about the mom who gets up in the morning at 7 o'clock and has to drive the only car they got maybe to work, whatever, and that kind of true accessibility to get kids to these schools. And that's true choice. You know, Mayor Bredesen and I used to debate about this a lot. He talked about choice across the system, and I said, I'm fine with it. You know, I wish all schools could have choice. I said, but you know, when I go to Kroger's in my neighborhood, they don't have the same products necessarily. That's when I go to Green Hills. You know, so the choice is not quite the same. You know, that's the kind of choice I'm talking about. You know, where everybody's got the same silverware, everybody's got the same plates to eat out of. You know, that to me is an important part of diversity.
Very. Yeah, yes, sir.
Yeah. Thank you for your service. Thanks. My name is Fabian Bedne, and I have my kids went to public school, magnet schools and regular schools, and I just love the school system. I have to say, I have been very lucky to benefit from the Nashville public education system. So I don't understand why people send their kids to private school, but that's just me. Now, my daughter went to elementary school at Shane, and you know, we're Jewish, white, Latino. Her best friend was a Bangladeshi Muslim, and the other best friend was a black Christian girl. And I think that that's what is important for our democracy. You know, when we have kids that attend public school and get exposed and get to know and get to learn about other people, that's real diversity right there. That's what you're talking about. It's not a quota. It's just really the real world out there is made out of people from all backgrounds. I know I sound like kumbaya or whatever, but it's very real to me because I know these kids, and I know that my kids are better off because they attended these schools. And so I just wanted to say thank you for creating a school system that does that. Now, again, talking about diversity, 10% of the Nashville is Latino, and an even higher percentage of kids on public schools are Latino, yet there is no Latinos on the school board and very few on the administration. So I was just wondering if how that line up with the original ideals of creating the consolidated system. Thank you.
Interesting. Let me say this. Go ahead, Bob. You got to come out.
He didn't mention he was a council member.
All right. Let me say, I wish I could say to you, every Wednesday night for the next 2 years, we'll resume this discussion, have the same panel members, and we'll go on and deal with these questions. We know public education has many issues to face which must be resolved. The audience who's here tonight, I appreciate your presence, your thoughtfulness, and why you're here, and hope that you will continue to be actively participating in whatever fashion, as a member of the Metro Council, the Board of Education, local PTA, or whatever it may be, to have your input to a public school system of which we can be proud. Those of us who had the pleasure of having some hand to play when the Metropolitan Government was adopted had great dreams for what this community could do. And many of those dreams have been accomplished. But many of the issues yet remain. And there is no one answer that solves every problem for us. I really want to say to John Siegenthaler, we thank you, the First Amendment Center and the Siegenthaler Center, for hosting these opportunities to get together. They've been very productive. We'll continue to do this now until the 1st of April next year. That will be the day which 50 years after the first mayor, vice mayor, and 40-member council was sworn in. A lot of water has run over the dam or under the bridge since that time, and there's a lot more yet to go. So citizen participation in one fashion or another is very important to the success of local government and public education. We thank you for being here. Hope that you'll come to more of these meetings, and thank you for your participation. Yep. And to these panel members, yes, Ed?
Yeah, I want to say I'm for having them every Wednesday, just not with the same panel. but I think you can find some real good people out there that know a lot more than I do. But I thank you too for listening and putting up with my preaching. I just have a habit of getting emotional about certain things.
Their questions and comments were very perceptive. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here. I hope you'll come to more of these and be on hand 50 years after April the 1st of 1963. That's it. Good evening.